Every weekend, I get a little treat from Shonen Jump Weekly that releases a handful of chapters for various ongoing series. Some of my favorites include the widely popular Jujutsu Kaisen that has some of the best action and high stakes in Jump, Blue Box, which is a cute new romance series about two communicative and almost unrealistically mature teens, Mashal, which is pretty funny and has some of my favorite art, and Red Hood, the Hunter's Red Guild, which I seriously can't wait to see where it goes. I mean, just look at this manta ray. Look at the crab, this giant. It's gonna be great. I'm sure it will. But there's only one current series that I've read twice. One that I think is fairly underrated. Undead Unluck. Now, Undead Unluck isn't unknown. In fact, I believe it's fairly popular in Japan, and it does have 70 plus chapters, which can't be done without some measure of sales. However, I don't see many people talk about it in the West, although by the West I mean YouTube and Reddit, so maybe I don't have the widest scope. But nevertheless, I wanted to recommend one of, if not my favorite weekly shonen, Undead Unluck. So let's start with the premise. One day, a lonely young girl named Fuko is about to jump off a bridge, shouting that if people around her touch her body, that they'll be in danger of dying. While she was looking away, a confident man named Andy approaches her and squishes her face, curious as to what the disease will do. Quickly after he lets go of her, a chunk of the bridge that they were standing on breaks and Andy falls right into an oncoming train. Fuko goes to see the result of her disease, which she calls unluck, when Andy's head comes rolling toward her and his body starts regenerating. Just as soon as Fuko realizes he's undead, he snatches her away to an abandoned building. It's here that we learn two things. A, that there's an organization after them because they're considered threats, and B, Fuko's unluck correlates with how much she likes the recipient of her unluck and how affectionate the contact that triggered the unluck is. So, get away from the organization. Fuko kisses Andy's decapitated head, and the meteor that crashes down signifies the beginning of Andy trying to woo over Fuko in hopes of the greatest death ever. This is an alright start to a series. It might not be the best hook ever, but it sets up many things that give Undead Unluck its identity. First, I'd like to talk about what exactly Andy and Fuko are. Negators. Negation is basically the shonen superpower of this series, but it's probably one of my favorites. Each type is unique, but fundamentally similar. They're all very powerful and can make for some heavy action, but they each have a set of rules or conditions to work around that make it just as much a game of strategy when fighting. Take the ability Unluck for example. In the first chapter, we learn that the more surface area of skin being touched, the amount of affection she has for the person, and the affectionate actions can all increase the unluck of an event. This means when she's paired with Undead, she's a huge glass cannon because she just needs to rub him a bit, throw his head at someone, and they're probably dead. Undead, on the other hand, can use his regenerative abilities to create explosive forces out of chopped off limbs to jump around or use as bullets. He's also been undead for who knows how many years, and the knowledge that comes with it certainly aids him in battle. With this in mind though, he isn't infallible. Strong, yes, but it's possible for him to be trapped, which has been done by Gina, otherwise known as Unchange. Speaking of Gina, the fight between Andy and Fuko against Gina is one of the first battles that demonstrates both the strategy and action that goes into fighting negators. And it's only within the first 10 chapters, so I don't consider it much of a spoiler. When first facing Gina, Andy and Fuko don't know that she's unchanged and don't have much to go on other that she can create invisible barriers. But as the fight goes on, more and more information is given, allowing Andy to figure out her ability. First, she telekinetically lifts up a lake, which she's able to stand on and walks down invisible stairs. This means she can solidify things, manipulate them, and create invisible barriers somehow. Using this information, Andy flashes her a flash grenade, not his penis, surprisingly, which works, and he slashes at her only to be met with another invisible barrier. After thinking through this a bit, Andy gets cut in half by her hat and notices something a little off. There's some blood that isn't attached to the hat, but rather floating around it. This is enough for him to figure out her ability and uncover what she negates: change. I would also like to briefly mention before continuing that Andy isn't sitting idly by when thinking through this. He's attacking, jumping around, shooting bullets, and dodging attacks. This combination of strategic thinking and classic shonen action is part of what creates the foundation of Undead Unluck. Continuing on, Now that Gina's ability is figured out, there needs to be a way around it. After bouncing around a bit, Fuko notices that she's speedwalking instead of running. She also leaves behind a trail of blood when walking on the water. This leads Andy to conclude that there must be some sort of hole on the bottom to allow her to move. Using this knowledge, some physics, and unluck, Fuko chucks Andy's head into her bubble to put her out for good. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this isn't the perfect fight, and I'll get into that later, but I still think it sets a good example of what the fights in Undead Unluck are all about. Careful consideration as to the rules and abilities surrounding each negator while simultaneously trying to avoid attacks and retaliate when possible. Okay, I've been writing this for a while now. It's been a few days since I started this, and it's been taking a bit because of school, and I have to get college applications ready, which are kind of a pain. So would anyone be so kind as to tell me what day it is? August 28th. Saturday? What's Saturday? See, I was actually curious, and it turns out that Saturday is named after a celestial body named Saturn. But what's Saturn? There aren't any other celestial bodies other than the Earth and the Moon. So what, or where, could Saturn be? This is what an uninformed negator would sound like after the 100th penalty had been added. I was adding days of the week and celestial bodies penalties? And penalties for what? Well, let me elaborate. After defeating Gina, Andy and Fuko joined the Union, the organization that tried to kill them earlier, and learned some of the secrets of the world. Every 3 months, there's a set amount of quests given by Apocalypse, which looks like the mimic of books. Each quest cleared is given a reward, but if there are any quests left uncleared, then a penalty is added to the entire world. There are some examples that Huis lists, but the only one that we've seen so far in action is the addition of the Uma galaxy. This Uma gave rise to the other planets, stars, and of course, invading aliens. Granted, this wasn't too harsh of a penalty since they were defeated in like a chapter, but it's only because I got lucky. However, what I find so interesting about these Umas is the personification of everyday actions or abstract concepts into these monstrous figures. There is absolutely nothing that is off the table when it comes to an Uma. The act of spoiling or eating, the idea of language or past, it can all be an enemy. As of now, the current arc has everybody going against the Umas of each of the 4 seasons, which has been a wild ride so far. The reward/penalty system has also been able to keep the plot moving in unexpected ways. See, you might think that invading aliens would maybe create a small arc, but they only last like a chapter. Instead, the unification of language has much more impact upon moving the plot forward. Since only non-negators were affected, anyone that was a negator that didn't speak English when the reward was added would immediately stand out. This led to the capture of Unmove and consequently a little arc. Moving on to one of the best points in Undead Unluck is kinda hard. I've always held thoughts about certain characters, but since I never wrote them out until now, it was hard to gauge just how difficult it would be to make something comprehensible. Either way, I hope I can convey it well. Each character feels unique and lovable, but I think I'll just focus on a few. Andy is a wild and chaotic zombie that runs around into any danger he can find. He doesn't have any concern for his life, which is fair considering he is undead and the whole point of the story is to kill him. He also tends to simultaneously be a stud and womanizer. With Fuko, he seems to have limits and actually wants to woo her over, but he can really push those limits to its brink sometimes. What gives Andy his full character, though, is just how much he cares about everyone. He's undead, so it doesn't matter how many times he's shot, sliced, or beaten up, he can just regenerate whatever he needs. But everyone else doesn't have that luxury. They have a definite lifespan that can effortlessly be taken out if they're not careful, which, unfortunately, Andy knows all too well. His desire to protect everyone is rooted in a sense of responsibility because he knows that every time anyone dies, if it had been him, he would still be alive. This also explains his extremely gung-ho nature in the beginning, considering over time he probably realized it's better that he joins the fray first than anyone else. His desire to protect everyone especially comes out in Fuko, a lonely, isolated shut-in that used to spend her days reading shoujo manga since going out would cause everyone too much harm and her too much stress. She fantasized about going out and being able to live out her shoujo dreams, but being burdened with unluck made it almost impossible to do anything of the sort. Until she met Andy. Being able to connect with someone that wouldn't be killed if she touched them was, surprisingly, a huge deal for her. Not only that, but she was able to be introduced to more people like her in the Union. She's easily one of the most relatable and human characters in the series. Some of my favorite moments in the series come from little conversations that she has with other people. Do you like change? What does it mean to die? What is love? Nope, I'm not. Every time these conversations appear, they feel like it's two people giving their perspective and what they believe. No one's right or wrong, and it's not super drawn out or philosophical. It feels like two people were picked off the street and they were just being honest with each other, which really helps give her a sense of humanity. Now, there is a great supporting cast to Undead Unluck, but the next two that I wanted to mention both revolve around heavy spoilers. The first one revolves around some twists, and the other covers pretty much an entire arc. I just want to put this warning here because I believe that both of these things would best be experienced going into it blind. With that out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about Billy, who actually doesn't have that much to him currently. What I wanted to talk about is the potential he has as a character in the future. Our first big question that appears from Billy comes around chapter 31 when Billy takes the round table and reveals that he's a part of Under, a secret organization that acts against Union to fulfill their own priorities. Not only that, but his ability is unbelievable. No, it's actually unbelievable as he whips around the room as unstoppable, regenerates like undead, and uses injustice against Huis. This raises questions such as what is his ability, why did he betray the Union, how did he come to be with Under, and how does nuking people save people? Fast forward like 20 chapters, and some of the questions are answered, but with only more questions to boot. We find out that he's a concept type, but since nobody knows what that is, it just leaves us a bit more lost, and as for his motivation, well, when Huis tried to use injustice against him, it ended up taking her arm, which reveals that Billy actually believes what he's doing is for the benefit of the Union. But how? These are questions that will probably remain unanswered for a while, but I'm very eager to see where it goes and figure out who Billy is along the way. Now, the main reason I wanted to get into spoilers was to talk about the Autumn arc, or more particularly, Anaun, who's without a doubt one of my favorite side characters I've had the pleasure of coming to know. I will reiterate, this will spoil the majority of the arc, and it's definitely my favorite so far, so if I've convinced you, then please catch up before continuing. If not, then do as you may. The arc begins by explaining how a popular manga series, To You From Me, parallels certain events that have occurred within the Union. After some investigation, they find some of the raws which turn out to be in Japanese, proving that it's some sort of prophet/artifact unaffected by the changes in the rules. This leads them to meet up with a mysterious and practically unknown author, Anaun. This eccentric mangaka can draw anything out of thin air, whether it be planes, guillotines, or even an arm to replace the one he chopped off. He's fun, bubbly, cool, and not real. He's actually a character made up from a boy named Akira Kuno. As a boy, Akira loved to listen to and create stories for his mom. One day, while walking around, Akira found a pen that revealed such spectacular events and stories that he immediately ran home to show his mom. As he was drawing up everything he could remember, his mom came home. Just as he was about to show her the images that he saw, he realized he couldn't. He couldn't speak to her, he couldn't touch her, he couldn't do anything to get her to notice him. He couldn't get anyone to notice him. He was completely unknown. Facing this crisis, he knew he had to do something. It actually wasn't until a little while later he found out the events seen through the pen were actually real. Using this knowledge and the manga he published, he could communicate events that only he knew of to the outside world. Not only that, using the pen, he was able to figure out a bit of a loophole. He could create a character for himself known as Anaun that could be seen by everyone else. What I love about Anaun is the dichotomy between the shonen type character Anaun is and the shonen character Akira wants to be. Getting his arms cut off and standing his ground while using his mouth to drop artifacts is really cool, but in reality it's just the image of what Akira looks up to. Those stories he heard and the characters in them saved him from his lonely life as a negator, as he was able to find some sense of joy or relatability in them. I'm sure anyone and everyone has a character that they love, relate to, or look up to, so I find his whole character very endearing as it contrasts who he is and who he wants to be. He wants to be side by side with them, fighting Autumn while looking cool, when he can only sit back and try to pull some strings as to how it might develop. And in the end, he could only do it for so long. I won't spoil how it goes, but I will say the arc is about 15 chapters, and it really hits for just 15 chapters. Hopefully none of that was too confusing. I tried to include more exposition originally to make more sense, but I think it made less sense, so I tried to condense it a bit. Alright, now that I've sung my praises and hopefully convinced you to catch up, I'll mention a few things that bug me a bit. I don't think that Undead Unluck was planned out. I say this as a criticism because the first few chapters did not grab my interest, and when I first read it, I actually dropped it after just 3 chapters. You don't really get to see how interesting the battle mechanics are until the fight with Gina, and Andy comes off way too strong in the first few chapters. It seems like it'll go in a very odd direction with Andy constantly asking to bang and Fuko trying to get away, when in the future it's barely mentioned at all. Speaking of the negation mechanic, with such intricate rules and conditions to be met for each battle, there are also some little plot holes that tag along with it. For instance, why wouldn't Gina just close up her bubble and make herself levitate with her telekinesis? Or if a negator dies and their ability transfers after they die, why did this person retain their ability once they died and were revived? Also, why do some non-negators speak Chinese after the language unification? It's little things like this that make the rules and conditions of this world that make it such a rich experience a bit obsolete. But there's clearly one thing that irritates me the most, and could not be any more horrific than it already is. So, undead makes sense. Unstoppable makes sense. Unluck technically isn't a word, but it works with undead, so I'll allow it. But unjustice? Why not just unjust? That's an actual word, and it wouldn't affect the meaning of it. There's also unmoved, which I'm pretty sure also isn't a word, although unmoved is. But the worst, the absolute worst of the worst, has to go to undecrease. I understand the whole gimmick is that everyone negates a certain thing, but it's literally just increase with extra steps. I really don't like it. I'm assuming it must be a translation difficulty, but damn, it's really annoying. And that's mostly it. I think the only other things I would mention are art and comedy. The art is incredible most of the time, but I think that trend applies to most Shonen Jump series, and the comedy is at the very least tolerable, but it's highly subjective, so I didn't know how to incorporate it into this recommendation. And with that, I have finished. I appreciate anyone who stuck around to the end of the video. As I mentioned before, it's kind of hard to write videos and keep up with school. School will always be the top priority, but I do want to continue this, at least as some sort of hobby. I'm aiming for something like a video a month, but that might be a bit out of reach. I hope I didn't glamorize this series too much. I do think it's a good series, but I don't think it'll reach the peaks of something like Demon Slayer or Jujutsu Kaisen, even if an anime does come out. At the very least, I do hope that you give it a chance past the first few chapters, because it definitely is one of my favorites. Subscribe if you want to see more, and comment if there's anything you'd want me to go over. See ya.